and they knew that there was something with that character. What exactly that there was something, there was a lie around that character because she was a real character. And then when the novel starts, what Red Aunt is saying that now as they know that Vernie came back in the country because she wanted to continue the same war, then they need an explanation. So all the story is leading them to meet with Veronica and to see why she did what she did.
Dimitri, your book Hotline, really centers on the character Muna Haddad, who is a Lebanese woman who has come to Canada with her son. She has left Lebanon. Her husband has been abducted, and she doesn't know where he is. Um, at the very end of the book, you say that the character of Dad is partially based on your mother's experience. So can you just tell us a little bit about the genesis of this story,
Sure.
And how you came to tell it?
Well, when we moved to Canada when I was 11 years old, so that part's a little different, and more family members. But ultimately, the circumstances that set up a hotline were that my mother is a French teacher by trade. That aspect of the immigration application really helped move us forward and push us through. That's the coveted French language experience that's spoken of so highly in the immigration process here. And then when we arrived, no one would give her a job. So the reality and the ideology that were constructed around it were two different things. So after months of looking for a job, the only job she could get was working at a weight loss center. And so we started getting these yellow boxes of nutritional food coming into our house. And I remember thinking that was quite fun. They're actually putting food that you would otherwise buy at the grocery store in special boxes and marketing it differently, and people will pay more for it. And it's like, what a place. So that idea stuck with me for decades. I've had those yellow boxes in my head well into my 40s. And then the pandemic came around. And I found myself working on this story about these yellow boxes. And I thought I was going to start off writing something comedic about them. But then my mother's voice snuck in and came into the story. And I realized that I was writing a story about my mother's experience. And again, the longer I looked at that moment, it was no longer a comic episode at that point of how my mom worked at a weight loss center for 6 months. It became a story about how no one would give my mom a job and the sacrifices we had to endure as a result of those dominoes falling the way they did. And I realized that the story was still going on around me, and that the most prescient aspect of telling any kind, situating any kind of novel in a historical setting, which is strangely how people see the 80s. It's a historical novel. Is that that moment still has a connection to the present. And for me, that discrimination was that connection.
Luna Haddad is someone who obviously has experienced a lot of loss. She is someone who many might describe as being somewhat broken. Right? She's shattered by the fact that her husband is no longer. She doesn't know where her husband is, and yet she's put in a position where she ends up acting as a kind of supporter for people that she encounters on the phone. That she's a kind of a balm for them. And what I thought you were trying to kind of get at was that, you know, human beings have obligations to each other. You know, when you live in a community, you have obligations. And there is a need, in order for us to build healthy communities, there's a need for care. There's a need for people to be recognized. There's a need for people to be listened to. Social graces small gestures of kindness matter. Can you perhaps maybe elaborate on that? Because I found that there's something very moving about that aspect.
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to focus in on that aspect because I mean, this is my fourth novel. So in previous books, I've taken a look at that bigger picture, how society can find ways to grind a person down. And I'd already approached things from that ideologically pessimistic perspective. I knew that story. I didn't want to retell that story. And I guess the older I get, the more I realize that even with these systemic social inequities that we all occupy, there are still individual caveats, these moments of kindnesses within communities that occur between one person and another that counteract that. There's like a balance that happens somehow in society, even though society is fundamentally unjust in a lot of ways. We still find a way to make it through. And we have a reason for wanting to make it through that way. And it seemed to me that that was also an important story to share at this point. That yes, the first year of immigration is